Imagine yourself consumed by hunger and desperation, only to be turned away when you needed help the most. What happens when that pain transforms into an unrelenting thirst for vengeance? This isn't just a horror story. It's a warning. If you were in his place, what would you do? It was a cold, gray afternoon when he appeared, almost blending into the shadows on the sidewalk. Once a man full of hope, he was now just a broken figure, his shoulders hunched under the weight of despair. His eyes, once bright, now reflected the hunger and pain that gnawed at him with every step. He approached the market, the smell of fresh bread and ripe fruits filling his nostrils, causing a sharp pang of agony in his empty stomach. He hesitated for a moment, knowing his dignity was at stake. The hunger was stronger. With unsteady steps, he entered the market, people around him avoiding eye contact as if his misery were contagious. Spotting the owner, he gathered the last bit of courage he had and whispered, almost voicelessly, "Please, sir. Just a piece of bread. Anything." The market owner, a burly man with a look of disdain, glanced up from his accounting and fixed his eyes on the poor man standing before him. Without a word of compassion, he shook his head and gestured brusquely toward the door. "We don't give handouts here. Get out and don't come back." The owner's voice was as cold as marble, as sharp as a blade. The man, now without hope, felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. With a heavy heart, he turned to leave. But before he could take another step, he was violently pushed out of the store by the security guard. The impact on the cold, dirty ground was the final blow to his already fragile resistance. Outside, under the rapidly darkening sky, he looked one last time at the brightly lit market, where people shopped without realizing that someone had lost everything, even the will to live. And so he disappeared into the night, with the emptiness in his stomach overshadowed only by the emptiness in his soul. Night fell, heavy and relentless, wrapping the city in a cutting silence. That man who had once roamed the streets searching for a crumb of hope now walked like a ghost. His frail body could barely stand, and each step was a battle against the despair consuming him. The biting cold of the early morning seemed to seep into his bones, bringing with it the icy sensation that this would be his last walk. His trembling hands sought the non-existent warmth in the tattered pockets of his coat, but all they found was emptiness. His cracked lips murmured forgotten prayers, hoping that perhaps some higher power would have mercy on his starving soul. In the distance, he saw a park bench, the only refuge he could imagine in that moment of pain. Staggering, he approached it, each step heavier than the last. When he finally collapsed onto the bench, his body gave in to the exhaustion, as if all the years of struggle had suddenly come to an end. There, under the pale light of a street lamp, he looked up at the sky, searching for answers in the stars he could barely see. His vision began to blur, and the cold became unbearable. Minutes dragged on, and he felt his body slowly shutting down, like a flame quietly extinguishing. No one noticed when he took his last breath. The city continued its course, indifferent to the silent death that had occurred in that park. His body remained there, motionless, until the first light of dawn found him, but it was already too late. The man who had once begged for a piece of bread was now at peace, or so it seemed. Little did those who ignored him know that his hunger and pain would not end with his death. Something dark and vengeful was about to be unleashed from that abandoned soul, and its thirst for justice was just beginning. The city slowly awoke, as the light of the sun painted the horizon with soft shades of orange and pink. However, in that market, dawn brought something much darker. The owner arrived early, as he did every day, ready to open the doors and start another day of work. But as he entered, he felt an immediate change in the air. Something was wrong, something he couldn't identify, but it sent an uncomfortable shiver down his spine. As he began walking through the aisles, the sweet and familiar scent of fresh fruits was replaced by a putrid odor that seemed to emanate from every corner. Confused, he approached the fruit section, and to his horror, found that the apples, which had been perfectly ripe the night before, were now rotten, covered in a black, viscous mold. The owner frowned in disbelief and hurried to check the rest of the product. Within minutes, he realized it wasn't just the fruits. The meat, displayed in refrigerated cases, was also in an advanced state of decay, as if weeks had passed since it was placed there. Blood dripped thick and dark, as if the very life had been drained from the food. A subtle panic began to take hold of him. He had never seen anything like it, and his mind frantically searched for a rational explanation for what was happening. But the more he tried to understand, the more he felt that something was deeply wrong, something beyond what his eyes could see. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the market, where the light barely reached, presence was felt. It wasn't visible, wasn't tangible, but it was there. A shadow that seemed to move with a dark purpose, an intention that the owner still didn't understand, but would soon engulf him in a nightmare from which he could not escape. And so, unaware that he was being watched by eyes no longer of this world, the market owner continued his inspection, growing increasingly anxious, drawing ever closer to a terror he could not imagine. That day, one of the market's oldest customers, a middle-aged man known for his impeccable routine, entered through the door with the same neutral expression as always. He greeted the owner with a brief nod and began to stroll through the aisles, looking for his usual purchases. Something made him stop suddenly, an unexpected chill that ran down his spine. He couldn't explain what he was feeling, but it was as if the air around him was charged with a dense, almost palpable energy. As he turned a corner between the shelves, caught a glimpse of a figure that made him freeze in place. Standing by the bread section was a thin man, wearing dirty, ragged clothes, his skin pale as wax. His vacant, lifeless eyes were fixed on something distant, but when the customer entered his field of vision, the figure slowly turned. The man recognized that face immediately, even though something inside him wished he hadn't. It was the same man he had ignored days earlier, quickening his pace to avoid hearing his plea for help. That poor devil whom the market owner had chased away like a stray dog. But now, that beggar seemed like a shadow of what he once was. The customer felt his mouth go dry as the man's figure approached, steps light and silent, as if he were floating in the air. When he was just a few feet away, the man raised a trembling hand and with a hoarse, inhuman voice murmured, "Food, please." The customer instinctively stepped back, terror coursing through his veins. He wanted to run, scream, do anything to escape that sight, but he was frozen in place, as if something beyond fear held him there. Lacking the courage to respond, he took a step back, his breath erratic, and watched as the ghost of that man lifted his head, revealing a hollow smile, filled with a hunger that was not just physical. The customer fled the market, leaving behind his shopping basket and the last shred of sanity he had left. But the worst was yet to come, because that simple, sinister request would not go unanswered. That night, he would discover the true meaning of a hunger in a banquet of horrors no one could have imagined. Subscribe to our channel now and be the first to discover our most terrifying stories. Click and join our community before it's too late. The news of what had happened to the customer began to spread through the city like wildfire. Friends, family, and even strangers whispered to each other, exchanging looks of disbelief and fear. The man who had fled the market that morning was no longer the same. Something inside him had changed, something that no one could explain. That night, he locked himself in his house, refusing to answer calls or open the door. Fear consumed him. But it was more than that. It was as if an insatiable hunger had lodged in his chest, growing, pulsing, demanding to be fed. He tried to ignore it, tried to drink water, but nothing seemed to alleviate the growing sensation of emptiness, of a black hole expanding within him. Desperate, got out of bed and went to the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator, his eyes wide as he examined the packed shelves. With trembling hands, he began grabbing everything he could find: bread, cheese, meat, fruit. He devoured every bite with a voracity he had never experienced before, as if his life depended on it. And perhaps it did, but the more he ate, hungrier he became. It was like trying to extinguish a fire by pouring gasoline on it, an effort both futile and desperate. His teeth tore into pieces of meat, his lips stained with juice and blood as he stuffed the food down his throat without even chewing properly. His belly began to swell, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Hours passed, and he continued eating, faster and more desperate with each bite. The kitchen floor was covered with torn packaging and crumbs, but he hardly noticed. The pain in his stomach had become unbearable, as if it were about to burst. Yet still, he kept eating. Couldn't stop. And then, as dawn finally broke, the hunger was satisfied. Not by him, but by the dark force that controlled him. He collapsed to the floor, lifeless, his eyes wide open, but empty of life. His grotesquely swollen body was a silent testimony to the horror he had endured that night, and the only thing that remained was the echo of a simple request. Food. Please. The market, once a place of comfort and familiarity for the neighborhood, now seemed to be enveloped in an aura of fear and mistrust. Rumors of the customer who had fled in terror and later died spread like a plague, and the locals began to avoid the place. But those who still dared to enter inevitably felt the oppressive presence of something they shouldn't have ignored. Each day, the market owner became more paranoid. He noticed the dwindling number of customers, but that was the least of his worries. More disturbing was the feeling that invisible eyes were watching his every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. He knew something was terribly wrong. He couldn't understand what it was. Then, the manifestations became more aggressive. Products rotted in plain sight, as if the very air was poisoned. Fresh milk turned into a viscous black substance. Fruits withered within minutes, and meat, once red and succulent, transformed into something putrid, emitting an unbearable stench that drove even the bravest souls out of the market. The owner tried to remain calm, attempting to rationalize what was happening. Perhaps it was a refrigeration problem, he thought. Maybe the suppliers had sent spoiled goods. But deep down, he knew there was something far more sinister at play. With every new attempt at normalcy, something even more inexplicable occurred. The employees began to quit, one by one, all claiming to feel a presence, a darkness they couldn't endure. Some said they heard whispers while alone in the stockroom. Others claimed to have seen shadows moving on the security cameras. Soon, the owner was left alone, facing the nightmare he had unknowingly created. On the rare nights when he managed to sleep, his dreams were haunted by dark figures, hungry faces that approached him, their eyes empty, their mouths wide open, always murmuring the same words, "Food, please." And so, the market, once a symbol of prosperity, became a cursed place where the living dared not tread and where the dead continued to roam, hungry, waiting for their vengeance to be complete. The market owner, now completely isolated and consumed by fear, began to realize that the darkness wasn't just in his business. It had infiltrated his mind. He could no longer sleep. He couldn't eat without tasting the metallic tang of blood in his mouth. His once steely conscience was now corroded by guilt. He remembered, against his will, the starving man, his desperate eyes, and how he had been chased away like an animal. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that pale face, outstretched hand, the plea for something as simple as a piece of bread. But what had once been an uncomfortable memory now felt like a living nightmare, stalking him in every dark corner of his home. One night, unable to bear the growing pressure, he decided to confront his demons. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and his despair, he returned to the market, determined to find the source of the curse. The doors, which had never resisted opening before, now felt like they weighed a ton. But he pushed them, forcing his way inside, feeling the cold, stale air wrap around his body. Every step echoed in the empty market. The shelves, now filled with spoiled products, looked like towers in a forgotten cemetery, shadows of a past he wished he had never lived. He walked to the bread section, where it had all started, and there, when he shone his flashlight on the floor, he saw something that made his heart stop. Footprints. Small, dirty footprints, as if someone with bare, filthy feet had recently walked there. He followed the prints, the sound of his own breath filling the sepulchral silence. The footprints led him to the back of the market, where a door he swore he had locked was ajar, revealing the darkness beyond. With a trembling hand, he pushed the door open, and then he saw it. There, in the corner of the storeroom, stood the spirit of the man he had left to starve, motionless as if waiting for him. His eyes were black holes. His skeletal body barely seemed to have any substance, but it was his presence, the sheer intensity of his hunger, that almost brought the market owner to his knees. At that moment, the owner realized there was no escape. He could feel the spirit's hunger, feel the emptiness growing inside him, an emptiness that could never be filled. There was nowhere to run, no redemption left. He was trapped in his own hell, created by his indifference and cruelty. Now it was his turn to pay the price. That final night, the market owner knew his time was up. Whatever that vengeful entity was, it was determined to drag his soul into the depth of despair. He could no longer distinguish between reality and nightmare. Spirit followed him everywhere, endlessly repeating that plea for food, like a curse that would never leave him in peace. He tried to apologize, to tell the man he could take whatever he wanted, but it was too late. His mind shattered, his beard unkempt, his eyes sunken and bloodshot from sleepless nights. He was greeted by a biting cold that made his skin crawl. This time, there was no doubt. The supermarket lights flickered weakly. Shelves were covered in a black mold that spread like a disease, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of rotting meat and fruit. And then, the figure reappeared from the shadows, almost materializing in front of him. The spirit of the starving man was closer than ever, its pale face twisted in an expression of pain and fury. Before he realized it, the market's lights began to go out one by one until the only source of light was the dim flashlight he held. And there, in the darkness, Spirit advanced. Not quickly, with the certainty of someone who had already won. The owner tried to retreat, but his feet were rooted to the floor as if invisible roots held him firmly in place. The spirit stopped inches from his face, and the owner could feel the cold, rotten breath emanating from its mouth. "Food," Spirit whispered, and at that moment, the owner felt an excruciating pain in his stomach. It was as if something inside him was twisting, tearing him apart. He was incapable of enduring the agony that consumed him. His hands grabbed everything within reach: rotten food, spoiled fruit, packages upon packages of food. He ate it all without even chewing. It was the spirit's hunger which had finally reached him. He tried to stop, but the pain was so intense that he was unable to stop eating. His eyes widened as he stuffed more and more food into his mouth. He remained there for a few moments, eating and eating without stopping, being closely watched by the man who repeated incessantly, "Food, food." And then, the owner's body fell lifeless, his face frozen in an expression of absolute horror. His swollen belly was a testament to the macabre feast that had taken place, but there was no one left to see it, no one left to hear it. The next morning, the market remained closed. No one dared to enter, and soon the doors were sealed, the building left to rot, along with everything inside. And so, the spirit of the starving man finally rested, leaving behind a place where evil had triumphed, and where no living soul would ever dare set foot again. If you felt a chill down your spine listening to this story, know that this is only the beginning. Our channel is filled with even darker and more disturbing tales, ready to test your courage and push you to the limits of fear. If you, like us, are fascinated by the unknown and the terrifying, subscribe now and join us on this macabre journey. Here, the fear is real, and the stories are unforgettable. Don't miss the next chapter, if you dare.